Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm your host, Ryan Coonerty. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal podcast, an organization dedicated to supporting innovative policymakers and ideas to solve our most challenging problems. We'll be meeting in Washington, D.C. in late November for our annual conference. Check out newdealleaders.org for more information. Hey everyone. Welcome to a special post-election episode of An Honorable Profession. The Democrats won back the House of Representatives and some other key races around the country. I thought there'd be no better person to talk to about these results than Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana. Why Mayor Pete? Well, first, he's a great mayor. And according to Barack Obama, he's the future of American politics. He's a veteran, he's a Harvard-educated Rhodes Scholar, an out gay man, and a guy who gave up big money and the big city to return to his hometown and make a difference. He's a New Deal leader, and he might just be running for president in 2020. We're going to talk to Mayor Pete about what he saw in last night's results and where this country may be headed politically. I also want you to hear more about his remarkable life story and his commitment to public service. I hope that you will enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And please tell your friends about An Honorable Profession and rate us on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. Hey, Mayor Pete, thanks so much for joining us today. It's the day after the election, and it gives us a real opportunity to hear your insights about what you think the implications of this election are and where our country may be headed.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So the Dems picked up the House, and we also lost a couple heartbreaking statewide races in Florida, Georgia, and in your neck of the woods in Indiana. So what are your takeaways from this election?
So a few things. One thing that we definitely saw is that conservative areas stayed conservative and in some places became more so. That's definitely a pattern that played out for the most part in Indiana and some of the other races that we were tracking. At the same time, we also saw a lot of areas that voted strongly Republican before either see the margin go down by a lot or actually flip into Democratic hands. I think one of the most interesting patterns is actually the generational one. The number of newer, younger candidates from Lauren Underwood in Illinois to Joe Cunningham in South Carolina who emerged as first-time candidates, stepped into what everybody expected to be a very uphill race. And we're able, largely by having the election really tie to local dynamics as well as national ones, to turn a lot of heads and win in a traditionally red district. We're going to be sorting through the math and drawing conclusions for a while because there were so many indicators that pointed in different directions. But I think, the biggest picture is you had a pretty strong wave at the level of the kind of national vote. But in the districts we're working with and the states that were on the Senate map, what it translated to was a healthy, if somewhat modest relative to expectations, gain in the House, and then just not possible to make the climb in the Senate.
And what are you seeing, especially in Indiana? Traditionally, races have been defined. There's been a national conversation, but as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. Are those days gone? Is it all one big national election now? Is it translating down to our level, the state and local level, where we're having conversations at the federal level? What are you seeing about sort of the changing dynamics of these races, if you're seeing a change?
Again, I mean, part of what I think you'll see is that if you're a Democrat in a conservative area, then the less national, the better. One of the reasons I think Cunningham succeeded out in the Charleston area in South Carolina was that he was partly focused on a very local issue, which had to do with offshore drilling, and gained an advantage over the Republican that way. We also saw some interesting kind of state and local issues that changed the answer, even here in Indiana. For example, we had a candidate named J.D. Ford, a young candidate for state senate in a very conservative area. Democrat, became the first openly gay person elected to the state legislature, and did so running against an established conservative Republican who has consistently stood in the way of Indiana getting hate crimes legislation. So another example of some of the more complex dynamics that make it possible for Democrats to win when we're focused on some of the things that are happening locally. I think the more national the race was, at least in the red states, the worse for Democrats. But here again, it's a little more complicated than that. Look at Chris Kobach being defeated in the governor's race in Kansas. I got to think that partly related to the way that Kansas has felt about things going just too far in a somewhat radical state-level conservative experiment, but also seems to be the case that Kobach's attachment to a president who is popular in Republican areas certainly didn't save him, and arguably harmed just as much as it helped.
So, sort of based on that, as people gear up, and they are already gearing up for 2020, not just for presidential races, but for all these state, local, and federal races. What would you advise candidates on how to talk to their communities, on how to talk about issues? We're less than 24 hours since the end of the election, so it's hard to draw, definitive insights, but what would you tell people right now?
Well, it's clear that there is a benefit to not being the same old. I think a lot of candidates did well, again, thinking about some of these young Democratic challengers who stepped up, whether it's people like Colin Allred in Texas or, hopefully we'll see good results from someone like Ben McAdams in Utah. I think his race is still too close to call as we speak right now. But, a lot of folks who didn't just look like a reflection of the familiar Washington game. And so I think one thing to think about is, how are you going to tell your own story and look like you're an alternative to what people are growing tired of? A second is that, you should stake out some of your own territory in terms of what it means to be a Democrat. We saw a lot of national security Democrats, or I'm going to call them that, people who are either veterans of the post 9/11 conflicts or people who had some role in a civilian capacity as frontline civilians in dangerous roles around the world supporting American national security. Not all of them pulled it out again, but it was clear that people who were running as Democrats with that background really beat expectations and beat what the numbers would tell you was possible in a lot of these conservative areas. And again, all politics really is local. So one thing we learned is that what makes sense in New Jersey is very different than what makes sense in Indiana or what makes sense in Texas. And those are the dynamics that I think we'll be really studying closely for days or even weeks as we assess the election that just happened and think about what it means for the next one to come.
One of the things that people are talking about in these elections is this idea that there's a new expectations on candidates to be more quote unquote authentic, to be less handled, less managed, to get out there and talk authentically. And, for better or worse, from our president to candidates across this country, you're seeing it. How, as mayors and as local elected officials, we have to be authentic because people knew us growing up, and
right.
Or they know us in a context outside of being a mayor. How would emerging candidates or people who are thinking about running the first time, how do you think they should navigate that desire for people to see real people running, but then also that means real people make mistakes and sometimes say the wrong thing and then get hit with it?
Yeah, I think the more people feel like they know you, the more you can afford to be a little bit vulnerable and even a little bit uneven as you're first getting on your feet. So it's a strange piece of advice to give or to get, be yourself, because I think one question is who else would you be? But I think the real question is how do you go about making sure that voters and people getting to know you for the first time, perhaps on television, really do get to know you as your authentic self. That's one of the reasons I think digital campaigning is getting so interesting. Whether it's tweets or Facebook Live videos, different mechanisms exist now that I think help peel away some of the layers and help people really to get to know candidates. And I think as a candidate or as an official, it's a great way to help make sure that people really have a sense of you in terms of your own style and not just the things that make their way into press releases or short television interviews. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that everybody should just try to, quote, go viral. A lot of the people who really captured I think attention and were very impressive within the Democratic Party because they had the great video, the great ad, the great viral hit that didn't necessarily translate into winning. It made a lot of folks, I think, very celebrated and exciting on the Democratic side, but it's not enough. So I would instead treat those digital tools as just a way to help make sure people get to know the real you and make sure they take their place alongside other, perhaps more familiar, more traditional ways of campaigning.
So I think that's a good segue into talking about the real you, Mayor Pete. So you have gone from the mayor of a mid-sized American city, albeit with a great college football team, to all of a sudden having a national profile, both in your race for the DNC chair, but also just generally as a voice that's coming out of communities where the Democrats haven't had maybe a coherent messengers or been able to tell their stories. How are you, as you're trying to engage a much bigger audience than South Bend, Indiana, going to try to maintain your authenticity to try to let people get to know you?
Well, part of it, I think, is that, when I am speaking outside of South Bend, Indiana, I'm usually speaking in some way on behalf of South Bend, too. Even if it's a political and not official capacity, it's a chance to share South Bend's story. And I think, one of the reasons people have paid attention to what I'm doing is really as much about our city and its trajectory as it is about anything connected to me as a person. I think people are especially interested to see examples of success in the industrial Midwest. I think there was an impression that was created in 2016 that maybe the only formula or the only way to connect with the industrial Midwest is looking backwards and offering a more closed vision of how the world works. A lot of resentment, a lot of nostalgia. And I think South Bend's story shows that that's actually not true. And one of the interesting things we've seen in recent election actually is that even if Democrats had their hopes up in some parts of the country a little higher than was actually possible. Actually, here in the Midwest, you look at places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. That's where actually the results were dramatically better than we saw in 2016. And I think it's because there really is space for a different conversation. So I enjoy sharing that story, and I think the more I make sure whatever I have to tell people outside of the area is rooted in all of the things that make South Bend's own story more compelling. Then I think that people are getting to know a story that, sharing it, if anything, makes me feel even more rooted in home because I'm taking something from home and just trying to make sure that the rest of the country understands what's going on and what it means.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. How, what is the story of South Bend that is sort of, I know, because we've dorked out together about city policy on, trash pickups or crime, in ways to engage and prevent crime or other things. But what is that story that can resonate on the coast and across the country that the industrial Midwest and South Bend specifically can tell?
Well, I think, part of it is the trajectory of a community like ours that was listed in national publications as dying less than a decade ago and is now growing in terms of population and investment, just to show that it can be done. In terms of how you do it, there's no formula for everybody, but I think South Bend's story has to do with coupling good policies with the right kind of tone, calling the community to its highest values, looking at a lot of areas where we threatened to be divided, whether it was around race or around our economic future, and finding that there's actually great strength and unity through our diversity, but also making sure we had just common sense policies that helped this community grow, whether it was transforming our streetscape to make sure downtown felt like a city again, or quickly addressing vacant and abandoned houses so that residents and neighbors could literally see and touch and feel the improvements that were happening. You've got to make sure that the rhetoric is backed up by results. And so much, I think, a government at any level has to do with making sure that conversation that calls people to values is backed up by a sense that we can also competently and effectively run a government. There are all these debates that I think consume way too many calories in the national space about the size of government, how big it is or how small it is. I think anybody who's operated at the local level, especially in a community that faces the different kinds of challenges and opportunities that a place like South Bend does, is that it's really about how you make sure government works for people. And it's about moving forward. It's not about how big or how small it is. It's about how we tune the instruments of government, use all of the different equipment that government represents to make sure people are safer, to make sure that they're freer, to make sure that they have a better platform on which to build good lives. Even if we're neutral in the political space about what makes a good life. We're not trying to tell people how to live lives. We just know that lives will go better if there's less crime and clean, safe drinking water and good road design and smart economic policy too.
A quick word from our sponsor. An Honorable Profession is brought to you by Tech for America, an organization dedicated to providing a platform to solve America's toughest public challenges. For more information, visit T4A.org. That's T4A.org. I think one of the things that you've been really good at and communicating to other mayors and just when you read the stories and people talking about South Bend is you've understood both the good policies, the clean streets and trash pickups and dealing with abandoned homes and all that, but you've also recognized how important it is to just build social connections and build hope in your community and build belief in your community. And you've done that, with engaging with downtown, which was not just a project, but it was also about giving people a real tangible sense that South Bend was going to go in a different direction. And then you also did it with your op-ed coming out to your community and really sort of engaging conversation so that some of these divides that we're seeing nationally, seem less important, and we start to give people connection and hope. And then once we have connection and hope, we can start doing a lot more. How do you take what you've done in South Bend to scale, right? Like it's easy because people knew you from growing up or they've had a connection with you. It's a community where people may know each other across generations or connect through football or other activities. How do you do it when there are social media and other forces really tearing us apart at a larger scale?
Well, I think it's always a tough thing to do. I think the reward system of social media, much like the reward system of the United States Congress, kind of presses us to be more negative, to be more divided. But I think what any executive learns pretty quickly is that you can and should be strong in your values and at the same time learn to be good at working with people who are very different from you and try to command respect for your positions, not by pretending that the positions are only half of what they are, but by making it clear that you came by them honestly and by recognizing that there's a negotiation to take place whenever you're trying to get something done. No matter what the job is, I think from dog catcher to president, so much of it is really down to two things. One is advancing good policies that are going to help anybody who interacts with your level of government do well. And another is to competently run whatever set of responsibilities has been handed to you. And I think that's something that is the case at every level, especially for executives. The third element that I think every mayor experiences, but that is also true of the more visible offices, is to call your constituency, your community, to its highest values. And I think if you can do those three things well at any level, even at the intimate level of local government in a smaller community, advance good policies, competently run an administration, and call a community to its highest values. I think doing that at the local level really shouldn't be that different from doing it at a state or national level. And my hope is that we'll see more of that style of leadership work its way from local communities to Washington, rather than see the style that's prevailing right now in Washington spread to the state and local level of government.
Do you think there's a hunger out there? Do you think there's a reward for people who do that? Because you certainly get rewarded in the other, as you mentioned, in the other direction for divisiveness. Is there emerging desire or rewards for people who can pull people together?
I think so. I think there has to be. It might be harder. In fact, it certainly is harder, but that makes it all the more worth doing. Otherwise, why are we even in politics? And I think that anyone who runs for office is automatically in an act of hope. There's an act of faith just in being willing to do that, because you wouldn't do it if you didn't think it was worth it and didn't think it made a difference. So it's also got to be guided by the right values. And I think, certain behaviors are certainly most likely to be rewarded in terms of attention. But one of the benefits that I think is a good habit that you can form, especially if you happen to be a mayor in a community where you're the largest community in the media market is you spend a little less time thinking about how to get attention and more time thinking about how to manage attention. And I think so much attention is already going to be coming to really anybody who is an interesting, promising, credible, emerging leader in our party, that the real question is going to be not how do you get the very most likes or tweets. I could point to a lot of people who are Democrats who probably get the most clicks right now, but are highly unlikely to command the most support. And instead, the question becomes, okay, how do you inspire loyalty? How do you move people? And how do you get people to come on board with the coalition or the program you're trying to build? That's a much more challenging question than how to make sure that most people have heard your name. But I think ultimately it's the more enduring and important one.
When you figure out that method, will you let us all know? So we can so we can start to engage people in a different way.
Well, I think we're all in it together. But one thing I will say is it's amazing how much you get in terms of opportunity and credibility and just a longer and longer leash when you're able to get results. And that's one of the reasons I think that so much of the future our party is going to be built on the strength of people who have already been doing good work at the state and at the local level, people who have that experience of actually getting real things done. Admittedly, it's a biased perspective because that's what mayors think about all day. But I think that gives us more room than maybe we've given ourselves credit for to pull votes from the other side and to build just a different account of how politics works. I think a lot of people are doing it right now. A lot of them are people I've got to know in the New Deal program. And I think there's just going to be more where that came from.
Thanks. And speaking of getting things done at the local level and building new models, about 10 years ago, you were a Harvard-educated Rhodes Scholar working at McKinsey in Chicago, making a bunch of money. And you chose to leave that and return back to your community. And I imagine that there are people just like you all over the country who maybe hopefully listen to this podcast, who are sitting, came from a smaller community, fought hard to get out, are in big cities, making good salaries. What's the case you would make for them to walk away and return home and try to engage in the local politics that you've described?
I've run into a lot of people with a story similar to mine. Grew up, as you said, in a place that had a lot of challenges. Maybe grew up imbibing the message that success had to do with getting out of home, only to realize that home meant more than we realized. And I think the concept of home is nearer to the center of our party's values than it's been maybe in a generation or more. But I meet so many people who also share that story, who saw a chance to make a greater impact, saw a chance to find a higher purpose, certainly a less glamorous environment, probably less well compensated, and maybe found ourselves, as I did, having to explain to people who were puzzled in bigger cities why I would be moving home. In fact, I've written a book that'll come out early next year, Shortest Way Home, about this very trajectory. But I also think a lot of people feel that deep down. And if you're in that moment, maybe you're in the warm embrace of an institution or a large organization that has a lot of prestige and takes good care of you, but you're looking for more in terms of purpose. You want to work on something that is intrinsically important to you, not just something that is professionally important to you. That could be a sign of a calling to public service. And there's a great risk, there's a great leap of faith that happens when you leave that warm embrace. But the reward on the other side is extraordinary. It's compelling. I think it's calling more and more people in our generation and younger to get back involved in their communities and to be involved in public service. Having gone through that experience, I'm so thankful. Thankful that I had the background I did, but also thankful that I was able to step away from it and do something different.
And can you talk a little bit about making change at the scale of a community? I mean, I think the other alternative is there's folks who are working in public service, maybe in Washington, D.C., who came from these small towns. What's the case for going for, even if you're engaged in trying to change the world, for coming back to a place like South Bend or another community, Santa Cruz, and trying to make a difference there?
Well, as you know, when you're at that level, you can get your arms around the changes that need to happen, and you can actually do it. Obviously, we need great people doing good work at every level, but when you're in that community local level, it's so much more hands-on. It's so much more tactile, and you get the feedback immediately. You know if something worked or if something failed, and you learn on your feet, and you keep iterating until you get something that serves residents well. The other thing that I find rewarding, even though it's also challenging, is the fact that at the local level, people who have a stake in your decisions, they know it, they let you know it, and you never have to wonder whether what you're doing is making an impact. If you inconvenience somebody with a decision, you're going to have to look them in the eye and explain why. If you make somebody better off in their life with something that you did, they will seek you out and they will let you know. And not just in terms of the fulfillment and the reward that comes from that, but also the growth and the learning that comes from that. I can't think of an environment that has that same just compelling dynamic to it. And the last thing I would say is for people from a new generation wondering where you can make the greatest impact. A lot of the barriers are just a little bit lower at the local level. You still have to find a way to figure out a community, make yourself useful, and get involved in the process. But I would argue that it's more welcoming to newcomers than any other level at a moment when we need newcomers coming into public processes and public service all over the place.
Absolutely. Desperately need you. So if you're listening out there, quit your job, move back to your hometown.
Come on in, the water's fine.
Yeah, exactly. It's all going to work out. But one of the things in reading your profile, so when you moved back, you ran for state treasurer at 26, and you lost pretty badly. Yeah. And then you ran for DNC chair and you lost. But from both those experiences, it seemed it's easy for leaders and for the media to construct these narratives where all these victories just seem inevitable and it's just sort of one step in front of the other. You've really benefited by losing. Can you talk about how you calculate that sort of risk and reward of taking chances and running for offices, and even at the risk of losing?
Yeah, and this is a conversation I'll be having in the next few days with a number of deeply impressive candidates who stepped up for the first time, fell short, but I think are going to be the very stuff that our party is made of going forward. There's something to be said for winning by losing, and it doesn't always happen. You certainly don't go into a race hoping for that. But I would say that I am as thankful and as glad that I ran in the races that I lost as I am in the races that I won. It's often where you grow the most. It's where you learn the most. And you can intrinsically do a great deal of good simply by campaigning. It's incredibly empowering to be able to communicate with people and to have the platform that you get. Holding public office is a platform to shape people's views and make change. But so is running for public office, even when you don't win. You can have a tremendous impact. It's one of the reasons why the conduct of campaigns is so important. And I think often that's overlooked. Running for office compels you to extend yourself to other people. It makes you grow in ways that just nothing else can do. And you never know what a given candidacy is going to lead to. So, my advice for just about anybody, look, there are some people who probably shouldn't run for office, but just about anybody who feels called and compelled to do it, is do it. You'll regret if you didn't. You don't want to miss a moment. And even if it doesn't go your way, you will grow, you will learn, and you will have had the chance to do a great deal of good. So, taking your advice in our last minute or two together, what are your plans? What are you looking at doing with taking the sorts of risks that I agree that other people should take? Well, I got a lot of questions to figure out on my own end too, and some of that's at a personal and family level, some of it's at a community level. I think anytime you seek any office, it comes down to looking at two things and seeing how they line up. The one thing you look at is what the office calls for, what the community or constituency you're hoping to serve really needs, and the other is what you bring to the table. And if you find a special fit, if you find a great match between those two things, that's how you know it's time to step up and run. In my case, I'm weighing that right here in South Bend, and I'm weighing that for some other things. And pretty soon I'm going to need to share with my community whether I'm going to seek another term as mayor, and a lot of other decisions will take their cue from that.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I hope the listeners out there recognize the power and opportunity in these hometowns and in engaging in public service, and really the model that you've set for so many people in this country. We're truly grateful.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful every day to serve, and always love talking with other people who are inspired to do the same.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully soon maybe at the New Deal conference.
I'll be there
later this month. All right, cool. I'll buy you a beer.
Good.
All right.
All right, I'll take you up on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Talk to you later, Pete.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders, and keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces podcasts. Special thanks to Plantronics, who provided a great headset to make this interview possible. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we are keeping things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.